Good morning. If you've ever been to a hospital, chances are that you've had an EKG done. An EKG is when they put leads on your anterior chest to listen to find out the electrical conduction of the heart. And usually they put 3 leads or 3 stickers and they can see the electrical conduction of the heart. But sometimes they put 6 more stickers to see it even better. Why do you need more leads or more stickers to see the heart better? Well, because 1 sticker is not enough. 1 lead is not enough. The more leads you have, the better you can see the heart. The heart is a complex organ, and just to see the entire electrical conduction in the heart system with 1 lead is not enough. Similarly, when we look at God and we study about God, we need multiple images, multiple illustrations to understand about God. And this is because God is an infinite being and we are using finite illustrations. So God is seen as a father, He's seen as a husband, He's seen as a friend, He's seen as a creator, He's seen as a deliverer. And we use all these images to understand who God is. Similarly, when we look at the church, which has its origins in God, the same thing happens. We need multiple images to understand what a church is. So a church is seen as a body, it is seen as a family, it is seen as a community, it is seen as a bride. This morning in a sermon entitled The Forgotten Family, I'm going to look at the church as a family. And I'm going to point out 5 characteristics of the church as a family. The first one is what I'll call a common goal. Every family has common goals, unsaid probably, but unsaid common goals. So for most families, it is to keep the family honor and avoid embarrassing the family and maintain the smooth running of the family. And that's why kids cannot share whatever they hear at home. They cannot come out and share. So every person in that family does whatever they need to do to keep the common goal of the family. And this is an easy common goal. Every church and institution should have a broad common goal which they need to follow. And not having that broad common goal can derail the family. Of course, we have broad goals and we have focused goals. What is the broad common goal in a church? What is the broad common goal in a Christian institution? And it is to please God and to bring Him glory. So in Psalm chapter 34 verse 3 it reads, "Glorify the Lord with me, let us exalt His name together." The reason why the goal of every person, of every church, of every Christian institution is to please and glorify God is because that is God's goal for Himself. So in Isaiah chapter 43 and verse 7 it reads, "Everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made." Romans chapter 11 verse 36, "For from Him and through Him and for Him are all things. To Him be the glory forever. Amen." Making anything else as the broad common goal will result in collapse because it is not lined up with God's goal. So if a family's goal is to maintain the family, it will collapse because the broad common goal should be to honor God. If a church's broad common goal is to maintain the church, or to please the leadership, or to please the members, or to please the culture, it will collapse because the broad common goal should be to please God and honor God. So the first commandment, therefore, is love the Lord your God. In Matthew chapter 6 verse 33 it reads, "Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness." Once we seek God and we please Him, then everything else fits into place. Like the wheels, like the spokes in a wheel. Once they are related well to the hub of the wheel, they relate to the wheel itself and to each other well. A common illustration that I like to use about goals is that of a soccer team. A soccer team has multiple positions, multiple players, but the broad common goal of a soccer team is that by the end of the game, they have put in more goals into the opposing net than the opposing team has put into their net. It doesn't matter how they do that. So to make that happen, they dribble more, they pass more, they attack more, they defend more, they do whatever they need to do. But at the end of the day, at the end of the soccer season, there needs to be more goal in the opposing net than the opposing team into their net. And so whatever disagreements they may have, whatever positions they may have, whatever importance of position they have, it doesn't matter. The broad common goal is the main goal. So we cannot lose sight of the broad common goal. Once there is a broad common goal, it brings together unity. In fact, one of the best ways to unite people is by putting them with a common goal. And that's why you can take a player from Argentina and a player from Brazil, which are traditionally opposing countries, and bring them together to a European football team, for example, and they will, because they have a common goal, they will work well together. Also, once there is a broad common goal, it works with disagreements. If we have disagreements with people, as long as we keep our focus on that broad common goal, we can keep our disagreements to one side and continue in the pursuit of that common goal. Of course, when we have a broad common goal, we also have multiple short-term focused goals that should line up always with that broad common goal. Secondly is individual responsibility. Each person in a family has a responsibility. So, for example, in our family, my 6-year-old son has a responsibility of when the dishwasher is done, his job is to take the clean spoons and forks and put them where they're supposed to be. Every person has a responsibility. The younger you are, the less your responsibilities, but the older you get, you pick up more and more responsibilities. Why should everyone have responsibilities in the family? Well, it's because some people can't do everything. It is better for everyone to do a little bit than for some people to do everything. It is also because some people in the family do certain tasks better than some others. So it's easier for the right people to do the right task. It is also important for ownership. Everybody gets ownership if they are all doing some responsibility which has lined up to the broad common goal. And the same is true in the church. Every person in the church should be given a responsibility. We need to make it a culture in our churches that everybody has a responsibility. Why? Because there'll be more ownership. There'll be more desire for outcomes. There'll be more desire for growth. There'll be desire for improvement. And then there is also more efficiency because more people are now free to do the things that they want to do or they're qualified to do, as we shall see in a minute. Also, it is very hard to be critical and judgmental when you are part of the team, when you have a responsibility and you are working. It is much easier to find fault in a church when you have no part of it. Responsibilities, of course, are now skewed in this day and age with our virtual churches, and so we have to pick up new responsibilities that we did not have before. Many issues result from people staying as spectators. In this soccer stadium, There are no spectators. Everyone in the church should get in and should be playing the game. One of the biggest causes for inefficiency in a church is the option of being a spectator. Is the option we give to people to be spectators in the church. Let me ask you a question. Are you part of a church and have not taken up any responsibility? Why? If you do responsibilities in your home, why not do responsibilities at church? Let me ask you another question. Are you a leader in a church? If you are a leader in a church, are you giving enough responsibilities, enough tasks to people of every kind? Are you giving enough responsibilities to every person in the church? There are two kinds of responsibilities, and I talked about this about 10 years ago in a sermon on evangelism. I think there are two kinds of responsibilities. First is what I call a gift. We all know what a gift is. A gift is what you are gifted to do, and people who are gifted to do all kinds of ministries in the church. There are singers, there are musicians, there are instrumentalists, there are speakers, there are preachers, there are teachers, there are miracle workers, there are organizers. All kinds of gifts are used in the church. Then there is what I will call a role. A role is something that you are not gifted to do, but you still do it because a task is there. Back when I was in India, we had a small church growing up. My dad was a pastor. We had kind of a home church, and then we met at a building, but it was a very small church. And then there was a need for Sunday school, to teach Sunday school to the small kids. I was the only person available, so I taught Sunday school to these little kids for almost 10 years. I didn't like it very much. I don't think the kids liked it very much, but I did what I had to do. The good thing is I still maintain contacts with some of those kids, and it's good to see that they are still growing spiritually and they're staying in fellowship with God. That is a role. When you do something that you are not gifted to do, why should you take up a role? Well, you take up a role because there are some tasks that don't have the right gifted person yet. And so if nobody takes it up, the task won't be done. So you take the task until the gifted person comes along. Or you take up a role or a task because you haven't found a way to use your gift in the church. And so until you find some gifts that you can use in the church, take up some roles. Rather than being a spectator and saying, well, I'm not a forward, so I'm not going to play this game, pick up some role until you find something that you are gifted for. The other reason why we need to take up these tasks as roles is because then we can distribute all these tasks. If one person does all the tasks and he's not gifted for it, it is very draining. It is true that when you do something that you're gifted for, you are energized by it. But when you do something that is a role, you are not energized by it. It actually drains you. So if some people are doing all the roles, they will be drained by the end of the day, by the end of the week. So it is easier to distribute the roles so that everybody is not, or nobody is drained too much. So every member has a responsibility to pick up gifts and to pick up roles. Let's look at an example. In Acts chapter 6 verses 1 through 4, The context is that the young fledgling church at that time was growing rapidly, and they had some growing pains. And some widows of one culture in the church was not getting fed like the other widows in that church. And so this is the problem that they had, and they were addressing the problem. Let's read Acts chapter 6 verses 1 through 4. In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, "It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers and sisters, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them and will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word." You see what they were doing? They were redistributing some of the roles so that gifts could be used. Nowhere here does it say that these 7 men should have a previous experience in the food and hospitality job. No, doesn't say that. In fact, the only 2 things it says is that they need to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. So these 7 men took on these roles while the others were doing their gifts, because if the other people also took on all these roles, nobody would be able to do their gifts. And this is in Acts chapter 6. In chapter 8, we find that one of these 7 men had multiple gifts. Philip had the gift of preaching and teaching and evangelism and miracles. In fact, he was responsible directly for the gospel going to Africa for the first time in Acts chapter 8. So he had multiple gifts, but he took on the role as a server to serve the widows. It may be that you may have multiple gifts, but you don't know it yet. And so you pick up different roles as you are figuring out what your gifts are. What if you made a comprehensive list? If you're a church leader or an institution leader, what if you made a comprehensive list of every single task there is in the church? If it's a small church, if it's a bigger church, give responsibilities to the missionary or the ministry team leaders to make a list of every task in their field and give it to the church members and see how many people can pick up gifts and roles so that all the tasks can be distributed throughout the church. And that will free each person to also do what they are gifted for. Thirdly, rules and freedom. Rules and freedom. Every institution has rules. Every home has rules. There are rules in our house. Some of the rules are no screen time unless you've done your homework and your home responsibilities. Or first dinner, then dessert. Obviously, that rule is only for kids. Adults can have earned the right to have dessert 3 times a day. And our kids, once they've grown up, once they've suffered through our parenting, would have earned the right to do that as well. But for now, the rules are first dinner, then dessert. Rules are important and necessary. British photographer Timothy Allen, best known for his work on BBC's Human Planet, decided he wanted to explore something challenging. So he joined with the nomadic Nenets tribe in Siberia on their 800-kilometer sojourn across the Siberian wilderness. And he walked with them in minus 45 degrees Celsius weather for 16 days. As he stayed outside with them. And there were certain rules that they had, including drinking reindeer blood to survive the bitter cold. And he said that if they made one mistake, you could die in 10 minutes. So rules are important and necessary, but having rules or making rules has never been the problem. There are plenty of rules. In fact, the problem is that there are too many rules. The more rules we have, the more control we have. So those people who are in power, they prefer to make rules so that they can have more control of the people that they are overseeing. And that is why we need freedom. With rules on one side, we need freedom on the other side. In the Garden of Eden, God made Adam and Eve, put them in the Garden of Eden. They had only one rule. And that rule was to not eat a certain tree. That's it. There was no other rule. They had complete freedom otherwise. Yes, you could argue that they hadn't sinned and so therefore they did not need the rule. But as you read the Bible, you see that the rules were man-made. And in the Old Testament, there are a ton of rules that are man-made. And as you come to the New Testament, Jesus gets rid of a bunch of rules that were completely unnecessary. This is something that I'm personally working on. In my family, I'm personally working on by trying to give more freedom to my family, to my kids. Because of my profession, because of my temperament, I am inclined to be managing and detail-oriented. Freedom, rules are great, but too much micromanaging can be very constricting. Lack of freedom can be miserable. Yes, giving freedom is risky, and there can be mistakes, but not having freedom will backfire both on the leader and is very miserable for the people that are under that leader. Some people err on the side of having rules, more rules. Some people err on the side of having too much freedom. So we need to strike a balance. And as long as we know that we need to stay in that center lane, even if we go back and forth, we at least are aware that we need to intentionally give more freedom. One of the most important things is to find out what the essential rules are. Only the essential rules are essential. So the 613 rules of the Sabbath, Jesus took and condensed them into 2 rules. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. Once you know the rules that are absolutely necessary, then you can let go of the rules that are not absolutely necessary and give freedom. Fourthly, what I will call irrational love and permanent disagreements. Irrational love and permanent disagreements. Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he responds this way in Matthew chapter 22, verse 37 to 38. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So the first commandment is love the Lord your God with every faculty you have. And the second commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. You see, there is a third kind of love mentioned in this, and that is self-love. But in this case, self-love is assumed. Jesus assumes that you have self-love because everybody has self-love. I suggest that self-love is an irrational love. Self-love is an irrational love. C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, on the chapter on forgiveness, talks about self-love. Well, how exactly do I love myself? Now that I come to think of it, I have not exactly got a feeling of fondness or affection for myself, and I do not even always enjoy my own society. Do I think well of myself? Think myself a nice chap? Well, I'm afraid I sometimes do. And those are no doubt my worst moments. But that is not why I love myself. In fact, it is the other way around. My self-love makes me think myself nice. But thinking myself nice is not why I love myself. In my most clear-sighted moments, not only do I think myself a nice man, but I know that I am a very nasty one. I can look at some of the things I have done with horror and loathing. However much I might dislike my own cowardice or conceit or greed, I went on loving myself. There had never been the slightest difficulty about it. In fact, the very reason why I hated the things I did was that I loved the man that did it. Just because I loved myself, I was sorry to find that I was the sort of man who did those things. We tolerate ourselves and love ourselves way more than we tolerate anybody else and we love anybody else. Self-love, I think, is the most irrational love. But right next to self-love, the next irrational love is family love. I think family love is also an irrational love, not as much as self-love. Let me give you a couple examples. Our family is involved in drug and alcohol rehab, and we've done it for the last almost 2 decades now. And we have people who come to our centers who've been on drugs or alcohol for 10, 20, 30 years, and their lives are completely messed up, and now here they are. After the first few years of using drugs, a person's resources are kind of used up. But what happens after that is that their mother or their parents give them the money to go buy drugs. They know in their mind that that's not the right thing to do, but yet they cannot see their child suffer, and so they enable that habit, and that goes on until they have used up all their parents' money as well. You see, it is an irrational love. Let me give you another example. Let's say that your 18-year-old son was driving his car for the first time, and in a lonely road he accidentally hit somebody and the person died. Your son comes back home and says, "Nobody knows about it, nobody saw me." No matter what you think, what is your first instinct? Is your first instinct to call the police on your son? That's the right thing to do. But usually the first instinct is to protect your son, right? There are many examples where family members protect criminals because of family love. It is irrational, but family love is irrational. So when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, yes, we have self-love, and it is irrational. We have family love, that is also irrational. So all we need to do is love our neighbor like our family and like ourselves, just in the irrational way that we love ourselves. I'm not suggesting that you cover up crimes for your neighbor and church member and help them escape. Nope, that is not what I'm saying. If the church is a family, do we have an irrational love for the church members? Do we have that kind of an irrational love for our church members that we have for ourselves or for our family? On the other side of irrational love is disagreements. Do you have disagreements in your family? Of course you do. Every family has disagreements. In Luke chapter 22, verse 24, it says, "A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest." And the Greek word for dispute is the word ready to argue. These are the disciples that have left their families, they've come together, now this is their family. Who is the head of the family? The head of the family is the Prince of Peace. And yet, these disciples have disagreements, disputes, and readiness to argue. I suggest that a family that has disagreements has a closer bond than a family that has no disagreements whatsoever. Why? Because we are fallen human beings. And as fallen human beings, we have our own idiosyncratic tendencies and our own individual quirks. And the moment we come closer to somebody else, we have the tendency to annoy each other. That's just human. You just have to get close to anybody, and you can be annoyed and annoy somebody else. It doesn't change whether we are believers or not. In fact, if you and your spouse are Christians, believers, growing, do you have disagreements? Of course you do. So it doesn't matter whether you're believers or not. The fact that we're human makes us have disagreements as we get closer to people. In fact, in our houses, you can have a disagreement that keeps recurring. Do you have a disagreement with your spouse where you had the disagreement and several months later the same disagreement pops up? And several months later the same disagreement pops up. It's not like you had a disagreement, you came together, you understood each other's side, and you agreed, and now you are in agreement on that one topic. No. You are in disagreement, you disagree, and you move away and continue to disagree. So it doesn't matter whether we are believers or not. If that is true, then we should allow for disagreements in the church. I suggest that a church family with disagreements is a closer church family than one that has absolutely no disagreements. Why? Because it shows a closer bond. I'm not suggesting that we go out and start fights with people that we don't like. We should allow for disagreements in the church because it shows a closer bond. And if we allow for disagreements in the church, then people won't think there's a problem when there is a disagreement. Right now we think everything has to be smooth and calm and quiet and a spirit-filled, peaceful life, and we don't allow for disagreements. So when something happens, people think there's a problem. And also by allowing for disagreements, we can learn to live together with the disagreement, just like we live together with disagreements in a family. And it may be so that the same disagreement may keep popping up again and again in the church between the same two people, just like it does in the family, but that's okay. If we have talked about it and if we have agreed that it's okay to disagree and continue to live. But both go together. Irrational love and disagreements go together. If we get close to people enough to have irrational love, then we will have disagreements. But if you're having disagreements only but not irrational love, well, then there's some other problem. Fifthly is what I will call daily adoption. Some of you may be adopted. Some of you may have siblings that are adopted. You may have a family that you know. Somebody in your family is adopted. A friend who is adopted. I have a friend who has 4 kids, and he and his wife were foster parents to another kid, 2 or 3 years old. they were foster parents for 2 years, and then they adopted that child. So now they have 5 children. Let's say that you're planning to adopt a child. Adoption is messy. There's lots of waiting, there's lots of phone calls, there's lots of paperwork you need to fill out. It's a long, arduous, tedious process. Lots of people to contact, lots of hoops to jump through. And after you've jumped through all the hoops, now your child comes home. And finally, when the child comes home, is that the end of the story? No, that's just the beginning of the story. Because now you see, they have to learn to live with each other. There is a change of routine. There is a change of the status quo. The adopted child needs to learn how to live in this new family. It may be a new culture. It may be a new language. The existing family needs to learn how to live with this new other person that was not a family before, but now they have to consider as a family. Similarly, evangelism is messy. We forget that evangelism is messy, and we are surprised by the mess in evangelism. We may have personal or cultural reasons that prevent us from doing or having evangelism in our churches. And that's probably because it is messy. Let me give you an example. In the church that I talked about, that I grew up in our home church back in India, we had the church for many years, and then we had this ministry among drug and alcohol addiction. Some of you see where I'm going with this. On Sunday morning, after we started the ministry with drug and alcohol addiction, on Sunday morning what happens? The former drug addicts and the former alcoholics now need to come to church to worship. So they do come to church to worship. Does that go smoothly? Absolutely not. The existing people, some of them, caused a problem because they didn't want drug addicts to mingle with their family. Evangelism is messy. Adoption is messy. Living together in a family situation with people that were not your family before, that is messy. And many times we forget that we ourselves were outside the family of God, and we were adopted, and we were brought in, and we were accepted. And we were made part of the family. And so Paul has to keep reminding us to remember that we were once sinners. So in Ephesians chapter 2 verse 13 it reads, "But now in Christ you who once were far away have been brought near." Ephesians 5:8, "For you were once darkness, but now you are the light in the Lord." Colossians 1:21-22, "For once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now He has reconciled you." It takes a while for things to become normal, doesn't it? In an adopted family, when the new kid comes in, it takes a while for the two groups of people to learn to adjust to each other, and it may take many years. In some rare cases, it'll never get normal again. Let me ask you a question. What if you adopted a child and it's not normal? It takes a while for it to get normal. What if in your house you had a daily adoption? Things would never get normal. Things would always be messy, and things would never fit together. Being messy would be the new norm. Being imperfect would be the new norm in a house that has daily adoptions. If the goal of the church is evangelism, it will never come to a place of being perfect. A church that is truly fulfilling its mission and purpose will always be an imperfect church. In a way, having a steady culture is a sign of spiritual decline. And having a changing culture in church with imperfections and difficulties as the old family works with the new family. The old family accepts the adopted people, and that imperfection is a sign of spiritual growth. 3-year-old Michael Brown found himself unable to be with his biological mother, so he was sent to a foster home at the age of 18 months. For his 3 years, he lived in 3 foster homes, and he was destined, it seemed, to live in foster homes for the rest of his life. But on December 20th, 2015, Tara Montgomery, the 3rd foster parent, decided to adopt him. As expected, he was ecstatic, and a photograph of him at the courthouse where the adoption was settled went viral. There are many people outside our churches waiting to be adopted, that need to be adopted into the family of God. There are many hindrances to evangelism, but upsetting the status quo is the least excusable of them all. There is a need for the church to be as a family. Let me give you 2 examples, one from the east, one from the west. In the west, there is increased loneliness. In spite of the social media and the portrayal that we have on social media, there is a deep-seated need for fellowship. The increased individualism leads to increased loneliness in the West. In the East, the issue is that individual conversions from non-Christian families brings a need for family. And so whether you're in the East or the West, there is a need for family. And so secular groups are creating this family system because of the need for family. So there are many clubs and groups of different kinds. Almost any group can become a family if they choose to come together that way. Unfortunately, the church has forgotten that it needs to be a family. And the love of the people within should be one of the attractions of in the world in which the church is. Let me end with this story. On April 22nd, 2008, 2 Marine infantry battalions were switching out in Ramadi, Iraq. One battalion had just finished its combat tour and they were getting ready to go back to the US when the other one came for their 7-month combat tour. And they would overlap for a few weeks in this one building in Ramadi, and there were 50 of them, and in the same building there were 100 other Iraqi officers and policemen and some other allies in this building. 2 Marines, Corporal Jonathan Yale, 22-year-old, and Lance Corporal Jordan Harter, 20-year-old, 1 Marine from each of these battalions, were given the task to watch together the entrance gate of this building where these 150 Army people were staying. Jonathan Yale was a very poor kid with mixed ethnicity from Virginia. He had a wife and a daughter, and he was very poor with his $23,000 yearly salary. He was supporting his sister and his mother who lived with him. Jordan Harter, on the other hand, was a middle-class Caucasian kid from Long Island, and these two could not be more opposite. They were from two completely different worlds, and their lives would never have crossed if it were not that they were both part of the Marines. But here they were as one. For the first time, they are seeing each other because they are from two different battalions, and their mission was to stand the post and let no unauthorized personnel or vehicle pass. So they relieved two other Marines and took up the post at the entry control point of the Joint Security Station Nasser in the Sofia section of Ramadi Al Anbar, Iraq. A few meters behind them in the barracks are 150 people. 2 hours later, a large blue truck turned the alley about 60-70 yards and made its way through the barriers, past the serpentine Jersey walls, and came towards the gate where these two men with 10 Iraqi policemen were stationed. It stopped short of the two Marines and exploded and killed them both catastrophically. 24 brick houses were damaged or destroyed. A mosque 100 yards away was demolished. The engine of the truck was kicked out because of the blast and fell 100 meters away and destroyed a house. The blast was made of 2,000 pounds of explosives. The next day, in an interview, one of the Iraqi policemen said, "No sane man would have done what those two Marines did. A normal man would have turned and run away. They stood there and saved our lives." You see, the security camera showed that it took exactly 6 seconds from the time the truck came onto the alleyway before it detonated. 6 seconds. Those were the last 6 seconds of their young lives. John Kelly, former commander of all US and Iraqi forces, said, "Putting myself in their heads, I suppose it took 1 second to realize that this truck was dangerous." 1 second. No time to discuss with each other, no time to call their sergeant to get advice, just enough time to remember what their task was. Let no unauthorized personnel or vehicle pass. They had 5 seconds left to live. They took another 2 seconds as they carried their weapons, took aim, and opened up. In that time, the Iraqi policemen fired their AK-47s, and as the truck was halfway down the barriers, they turned and started running. In fact, in the security cameras, you can see the Iraqi policemen run in the opposite direction away from the truck while these two Marines were standing still. They have 3 seconds left to live. For the next 2 seconds, the Marines stand and fire continuously at the truck that was hurtling toward them. There was a lone suicide bomber inside the truck, and they fired continuously. Their feet were spread apart wide, and they did not back down. They did not step away. They did not hesitate. They stood forward, leaned in, and fired continuously. And there was 1 second left to live. The truck detonates, the security cameras go blank, and 2 young men go to meet their baker. But by countering the force that came upon them, they prevented the deaths of 150 people behind them. 6 seconds. Not enough time to think about their desires, their dreams, their families, their country, their plans, their lives, or even their deaths. But enough time to stand there and do the duty that they promised and were called to do. Ladies and gentlemen, the people outside, the people around us are too precious. Our time is too short for us to do anything else but the task that is at hand. My prayer is that we stand together and at any cost, we do the calling that has been placed upon our lives and the reason for which we were joined together. Amen.